She lost 12 children. The dark truth about Sister Orlean. Real quick before we dive in, I'm curious. Where in the world are you right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. The winter of 1978 arrived early in Harlan County, Kentucky. Snow blanketed the steep mountains of Appalachia, turning the winding dirt roads into treacherous paths that isolated the small communities even further from the outside world. In the valley below, where Coal Creek ran cold and black, stood St. Augustine's Home for Children, a weathered two-story building with peeling white paint and a crooked cross above the entrance. Sister Orlean had run the orphanage for nearly 20 years. At 53, she was the imposing woman with sharp gray eyes and hands roughened by decades of labor. The locals spoke of her with reverence, calling her a saint who had dedicated her life to caring for unwanted children in one of the poorest regions of America. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Sheriff Tom Bradshaw's patrol car crawled up the icy mountain road toward St. Augustine's. Beside him sat Margaret Chen, a social worker from Lexington who had requested this visit after reviewing discrepancies in the orphanage's records. Margaret was in her early 30s, ambitious and thorough, traits that hadn't made her popular among the old guard in rural Kentucky. "Sheriff, I appreciate you making this trip," Margaret said, clutching a manila folder thick with documents. "I know it's a long drive from town." Tom kept his eyes on the road, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Sister Orlean's been part of this community longer than most folks can remember. Whatever concerns you've got, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." Margaret opened her folder, scanning the pages she'd already memorized. In the past 22 years, 47 children have been placed at St. Augustine's. According to these records, 12 of them are unaccounted for. No adoption papers, no transfer documents, no death certificates filed with the state. "Kids run away," Tom said flatly. "Especially troubled ones. This is rough country, Miss Chen. Not every story has a happy ending. 12 children, Sheriff, over 2 decades. That's not a pattern of runaways, that's a pattern of negligence at best." The patrol car pulled into the orphanage's gravel lot. Through the falling snow, they could see children's faces pressed against foggy windows, watching their arrival with curiosity. Sister Orlean emerged onto the porch, her black habit stark against the white landscape. She smiled warmly, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. "Sheriff Bradshaw, what a pleasant surprise," she called out, her voice carrying the melodic lilt of old Appalachian speech. "And you've brought a guest." Tom and Margaret climbed the creaking wooden steps. Up close, the orphanage showed its age: rotting boards, cracked windows patched with cardboard, a roof that sagged in the middle like a broken back. "Sister Orlean, this is Margaret Chen from Child Protective Services in Lexington. She's here to review your records as part of a routine state audit." Sister Orlean's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Of course. We have nothing to hide here at St. Augustine's. These children are my life's work, my purpose given by God Himself." Inside, the orphanage was sparse but clean. 16 children between the ages of 4 and 15 lived there, sleeping in dormitory-style rooms with bunk beds lined against the walls. The air smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke from the potbelly stove that struggled to heat the drafty building. Margaret noticed the children immediately. How quiet they were, how they moved with careful precision, how none of them made eye contact with Sister Orlean. Years of social work had taught her to recognize fear disguised as obedience. "Sister Orlean, can we speak privately in your office?" Margaret asked. The nun led them down a narrow hallway to a small room dominated by a wooden desk covered in papers and ledgers. A crucifix hung on the wall, above a faded photograph of a much younger Sister Orlean standing beside a priest Margaret didn't recognize. Margaret pulled out her documents. "I need you to help me account for 12 children who were placed here but have no official records of departure. The first is Bobby Hutchins, admitted in 1957 at age 6. The last documented mention of him is in 1963, then nothing." Sister Orlean settled into her chair with practiced calm. "Bobby ran away when he was 12, stole food from the pantry and disappeared into the mountains. We searched for weeks. Sheriff Bradshaw's predecessor led the search party himself. The boy was never found." "There's no police report on file," Margaret countered. Things were done differently back then, Miss Chen. This was 1963. Half the county didn't have telephones. Reports were verbal, not written. Tom shifted uncomfortably, remembering stories his father had told him about the old days. The social worker wasn't entirely wrong. Record-keeping in rural Appalachia had been haphazard at best in the 50s and 60s. Margaret continued through her list. Sarah Duncan, admitted 1965, last mentioned 1967. James Pritchard, admitted 1969, gone by 1971. Emma Lou Hoskins. Emma Lou was adopted by a family from Virginia, Sister Orlean interrupted. A lovely couple who couldn't have children of their own. There are no adoption papers filed with the state. Private adoption arranged through the church, perfectly legal at the time. Not without documentation, it wasn't. The tension in the room thickened. Sister Orlean's smile finally faded, replaced by something harder, more defiant. Miss Chen, I've spent my entire adult life caring for children that nobody else wanted. Children born to addicts, to criminals, to parents who beat them or starved them or worse. I've given them shelter, food, education, and God's love. And now you sit in my office, in my home, and accuse me of… What exactly? I'm not accusing you of anything, Margaret said evenly. I'm asking you to help me understand what happened to these children. It's my job to ensure their safety and well-being. Sister Orlean stood abruptly. Their safety? Look around you, Miss Chen. This building is falling apart. The state gives me barely enough money to feed these children, let alone maintain this place properly. I pray every night that the roof doesn't collapse, that the pipes don't freeze, that we make it through another winter. And you want to talk about documentation? Tom placed a calming hand on the nun's shoulder. Nobody's attacking you, sister. We just need to clear up some paperwork, that's all. But Margaret wasn't backing down. She'd seen this defensive posture too many times before. In neglectful parents, in abusive foster homes, in institutions that prioritize their reputation over children's lives. I need to interview the current children, Margaret said firmly. Privately, without you present. Sister Orlean's face flushed red. Absolutely not. These children are traumatized. They need stability, not strangers asking them questions designed to undermine their trust in the only home they have. It's standard procedure. Get out. The words hung in the cold air. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, though he wasn't sure if he was reaching for his radio or his gun. Sister, he began, get out of my orphanage. If Miss Chen wants to conduct interviews, she can obtain a court order. Until then, she has no authority here. Margaret gathered her documents, her jaw set with determination. I'll be back with that court order, Sister Orlean. And when I return, I expect full cooperation and complete access to every record, every room, and every child in this facility. Outside, the snow had intensified into a proper blizzard. Tom's patrol car was already covered in a thick white blanket. As they drove away, Margaret turned to look back at St. Augustine's. Through the swirling snow, she could see Sister Orlean standing on the porch, watching them leave with an expression that sent chills down her spine. You believe her story? Margaret asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, navigating the treacherous road with practiced skill. I believe she's done a lot of good for a lot of kids over the years. I also believe record-keeping wasn't anybody's priority back when she started. And the 12 missing children? I believe we're going to need to dig a lot deeper before we start throwing around accusations. This is a tight community, Miss Chen. Folks don't take kindly to outsiders attacking their own, especially someone like Sister Orlean. Margaret stared out at the endless mountains, dark and imposing beneath their blanket of snow. Somewhere in those hollers and hidden valleys, answers waited. She just had to find them before anyone else disappeared. Back at the orphanage, Sister Orlean stood at her office window, watching the patrol car's taillights fade into the storm. Behind her, a young girl named Beth, barely 8 years old with tangled blonde hair and hollow eyes, appeared in the doorway. Sister, is everything okay? The girl asked timidly. Sister Orlean turned, her face transforming back into the benevolent mask she'd worn for decades. Everything is perfect, child. Just some busybodies from the city who don't understand how things work in the mountains. Come, it's time for evening prayers. As the children gathered in the common room, kneeling on the cold floor to recite their prayers, Sister Orlean's mind raced. The social worker was a problem, a persistent, intelligent problem that wouldn't be easily dismissed. But Sister Orlean had survived worse. She'd survived poverty, scandal, and secrets that would destroy her if they ever came to light. She had not protected those secrets for 22 years, only to have them unraveled now. That night, after the children were in bed, Sister Orlean descended the creaking stairs to the basement. The door was locked with 3 heavy deadbolts, unusual for a storage area. She pulled a key from beneath her habit and unlocked each bolt with practiced efficiency. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with shadows that seemed to move in the flickering light of her oil lamp. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with canning jars and old furniture. But in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of rotting boxes, was another door. Sister Orlean approached it slowly, her lamp casting long shadows across the earthen floor. She placed her hand on the rough wood, feeling the cold seep through her palm. "Soon," she whispered to the darkness beyond. "Very soon, this will all be over." Upstairs, Beth lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the other children's breathing. She'd heard the basement door open, heard Sister Orlean's footsteps on the stairs. Every child at St. Augustine's knew never to go into the basement, never to ask what was down there, never to speak about the sounds they sometimes heard late at night, sounds like crying or scratching or something worse that their young minds couldn't quite comprehend. Beth pulled her thin blanket tighter and closed her eyes, praying for morning to come quickly. In Appalachia, winter nights were long and full of secrets that the mountains kept buried deep beneath their ancient slopes. 3 days after Margaret Chen's visit to St. Augustine's, she sat in a cramped office at the Harlan County Courthouse, surrounded by dusty boxes of old records that had been stored in the basement for decades. The clerk, an elderly woman named Dorothy Phelps who'd worked there for 40 years, had been reluctant to help until Margaret explained she was investigating potential child welfare violations. "Most of these records are incomplete," Dorothy warned, her arthritic hand sorting through yellowed papers. "Budget cuts in the 60s meant we didn't have proper staff. Lots of things got recorded verbal-like and never written down proper." Margaret understood the challenges of historical research in rural areas, but 12 missing children couldn't all be explained by poor record-keeping. She started with Bobby Hutchins, the first name on her list, admitted to St. Augustine's in 1957. The initial intake form was there, filled out in careful cursive. Bobby Hutchins, age 6, mother deceased from tuberculosis, father incarcerated for armed robbery. No other family willing to take custody. The child was described as withdrawn, possible developmental delays, prone to aggressive outbursts. But after 1963, there was nothing. No death certificate, no adoption papers, no transfer to another facility. Just a notation in Sister Orlean's handwriting. Left facility of own accord, October 14, 1963. Search conducted, child not located. Margaret cross-referenced with Sheriff's Department records from that period. There was indeed a missing child report, but it had been closed after 2 weeks with a notation. Presumed runaway, likely perished in wilderness. Case closed due to lack of evidence. No body was ever found, no belongings discovered, no witnesses to Bobby leaving. He simply vanished. The pattern repeated with disturbing consistency. Sarah Duncan, age 7, admitted after her mother was institutionalized for schizophrenia. Last mentioned in 1967, then nothing. The notation read, transferred to family in West Virginia, but there were no names, no addresses, no paperwork to substantiate the claim. James Pritchard, Emma Lou Hoskins, Michael Chen, no relation to Margaret, Daisy Carpenter, the list went on. Each child admitted with tragic backstories, each disappearing without proper documentation, each explained away with vague notations that no one had ever questioned. Margaret's phone rang, startling her in the quiet records room. It was her supervisor in Lexington. "Margaret, I got a call from Harlan County's district attorney. her boss said, his voice tense. "He's not happy about you stirring up trouble down there. Says you're harassing a respected community member without proper cause." "Sir, I have cause. 12 unaccounted children over 22 years. I know what you have. But the DA is threatening to file a complaint about overreach. He wants you back in Lexington until we can review the situation properly." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "They're protecting her, can't you see that? Sister Orlean has connections in this county that run deep, and they're closing ranks. What I see is a social worker making serious implications without concrete evidence. Poor record-keeping isn't proof of wrongdoing, Margaret. Come back to Lexington. We'll review everything together and decide on next steps through proper channels." After the call ended, Margaret sat in frustrated silence. She knew what proper channels meant. Weeks of bureaucratic delays while Sister Orlean had time to cover whatever tracks needed covering. But she also knew pushing too hard without evidence could cost her career. Dorothy Phelps appeared in the doorway, her expression sympathetic. "You're not the first person to ask questions about Sister Orlean," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Margaret looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Dorothy closed the door and sat down, her movements slow and careful. In 1974, a reporter from Louisville came through asking similar questions. Young man, eager, thought he'd found a big story. He interviewed some families, talked to former staff at the orphanage, started writing articles. What happened to him? Nothing happened to him. That's the point. He couldn't find anyone willing to go on record. Every lead dried up. Former staff members suddenly didn't want to talk. Families claimed they'd been misquoted. The articles never ran, and he left town. Dorothy paused, her weathered hands folding in her lap. But before he left, he came to see me. Wanted to know if there was any way to get a court order to search the orphanage basement. Margaret's pulse quickened. The basement? Why? He wouldn't say exactly. Just that something about it bothered him. Said one of the former employees mentioned it was always locked, that Sister Orlean was the only one with keys, and that strange sounds came from down there at night. Dorothy leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. The employee who told him that? Found dead 3 weeks later. Fell down a mine shaft while drinking, they said. But Martha Hendricks didn't drink. Everyone knew it. The room suddenly felt colder. Margaret pulled her notepad closer. Do you remember the reporter's name? David Sullivan. If he's still working in journalism, he might remember something useful. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon tracking down David Sullivan. She finally found him teaching journalism at Eastern Kentucky University in Richmond. When she called, his initial response was guarded. I haven't thought about that story in years, he said carefully, and I'd rather not revisit it. Mr. Sullivan, 12 children are unaccounted for. If you know something. I know that trying to investigate Sister Orlean is career suicide, he interrupted. I know that everyone who gets close to the truth either backs off or suffers consequences, and I know that whatever is happening in that orphanage has been protected by people with power for a very long time. Please, Margaret said. I need to understand what you found. There was a long silence. Finally, David sighed. Meet me tomorrow at the EKU library, 2nd floor, study room C. Come alone and don't tell anyone you're meeting me. That evening, Margaret drove through Harlan's downtown, a collection of worn storefronts and shuttered businesses that spoke to the region's economic decline. She stopped at a diner that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1950s, its neon sign flickering against the darkening sky. Inside, the dinner crowd was sparse. A few coal miners still in their work clothes, an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie, and a middle-aged waitress who looked exhausted. Margaret took a booth near the window and ordered coffee. You're that social worker, the waitress said, not making it sound like a compliment. One asking questions about Sister Orlean. Word traveled fast in small towns. Margaret nodded, deciding honesty was her best approach. I'm trying to account for some missing records, that's all. The waitress, her name tag read Linda, refilled Margaret's coffee without being asked. My daughter lived at St. Augustine's for 3 years back in the 70s. After her daddy died in the mines and I had to work double shifts just to keep the lights on. Linda's voice was carefully neutral. Sister Orlean took care of her when I couldn't. My Annie's grown now, has kids of her own. That's good, Margaret said carefully. A lot of children have been helped there. Some have. Linda wiped down the counter, her movements mechanical. Others, well, there were always rumors. Kids who left in the middle of the night. Kids who Sister Orlean said got adopted but nobody ever saw again. She met Margaret's eyes directly. My Annie used to have nightmares about the basement. Said there was something wrong down there, that she heard crying through the floorboards at night. Did you report it? Linda laughed bitterly. Report it to who? Sheriff Bradshaw's brother is married to Sister Orlean's niece. The district attorney's family donated the land the orphanage sits on. Half the county council has kids or grandkids who were placed there at some point. You think anyone wants to believe the woman they've been praising as a saint for decades might be something else? Before Margaret could respond, Linda glanced toward the door. I've said too much already, but if you're smart, you'll drop this investigation and go back to Lexington. Harlan County protects its own, and Sister Orlean, she's got protection you can't fight. Margaret left the diner as night settled over the mountains. Street lights were sparse and the darkness felt oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were closing in. She drove to her motel, a rundown place on the edge of town, and spent the evening reviewing her notes, trying to find patterns, connections, anything that would give her leverage. At midnight, her motel room phone rang. Margaret answered cautiously. Miss Chen? A woman's voice whispered. Don't say my name. I worked at St. Augustine's in the early 70s, and I need to tell someone what I saw before I lose my nerve. Margaret grabbed her pen. I'm listening. There were children who weren't in the official records. Sister Orlean kept them separate, said they were special cases that needed privacy. She called them her hidden lambs. We weren't supposed to go near them, weren't supposed to ask questions. The woman's voice trembled. But one night I heard one of them crying. A little boy, maybe 7 years old. I went to the basement door and listened. He was begging to be let out, saying he'd been down there for days. What did you do? I told Sister Orlean what I heard. She smiled at me. God, I'll never forget that smile, and told me I must have been dreaming. Said there was nothing in the basement but old furniture and supplies. The next day, that crying stopped. I never heard it again. Do you know what happened to the child? Sister Orlean said he'd been transferred to a facility better equipped to handle his special needs, but there was dirt under her fingernails that morning, fresh dirt, and her hands were scratched like she'd been digging. The woman's voice broke. I quit the next week. Told myself I must have misunderstood, must have imagined the worst. But I didn't imagine it, Miss Chen. Those children didn't disappear. They died, and Sister Orlean buried them somewhere on that property. Will you testify to this? Make an official statement? The line went silent for a long moment. I can't. My family lives here. My grandchildren go to school here. If I speak out, we'll be ostracized, maybe worse. I'm only calling because I've carried this guilt for 30 years and someone needs to know the truth. But I can't be the one to prove it. The phone clicked dead. Margaret sat in the dark motel room, her mind racing. She had anonymous testimony, circumstantial evidence, and a growing certainty that something terrible had been happening at St. Augustine's for decades. But proving it would require more than suspicions and old stories. She needed to get into that basement. The next morning, Margaret drove to Richmond to meet David Sullivan. The university library was quiet, students scattered among tables studying for midterms. She found study room C on the second floor, where David was waiting with a file box labeled St. Augustine's 1974. He was in his 50s now, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He didn't shake her hand, just gestured for her to sit. I'm only showing you this because I couldn't live with myself if more children disappeared and I'd stayed silent, he said, opening the box. But I want you to understand what you're up against. Inside were photographs, interview transcripts, and handwritten notes documenting David's investigation. He'd spoken to former employees, adopted children, and county officials. The pattern was clear. Children had been disappearing from St. Augustine's for decades, always explained away, always covered up. The turning point was when I talked to Father Patrick Donnelly, David explained. He was the priest who originally recruited Sister Orlean to run the orphanage in 1956. By 1974, he was retired and dying of cancer. Had nothing to lose by telling the truth. David pulled out a yellowed transcript. Father Donnelly told me that Sister Orlean wasn't even her real name. She'd been Agnes Carver, a woman from eastern Kentucky with a troubled past. She'd lost her own child in childbirth in 1952, a daughter. After that, something broke inside her. She became obsessed with children, convinced God had punished her, that she needed to atone. How did she become a nun? She didn't. Not properly. Father Donnelly helped her create a new identity, gave her the religious title to give her authority in the community. It was irregular, probably illegal, but he thought he was helping a troubled woman find purpose. David's voice hardened. What he actually did was give a disturbed woman unchecked access to vulnerable children. Margaret's hands trembled as she read through the documents. Did Father Donnelly know about the missing children? He suspected toward the end. That's why he talked to me. But he died 2 weeks after our interview, before he could make an official statement. Without his testimony, I had nothing concrete enough to publish. David handed Margaret a photograph, an aerial shot of St. Augustine's property from 1974. He'd marked several locations with red X's. These are areas where the ground showed signs of disturbance. Fresh dirt, settling patterns consistent with recently dug earth. I wanted to get ground-penetrating radar, but by then, my editor killed the story. Said it was too inflammatory without hard proof. Margaret studied the photograph. The marks were scattered across the property, near the tree line, behind the building, close to an old well. Places where someone could dig at night without being seen. There are bodies on that property, David said flatly. I know it. You know it. But proving it requires an exhumation order, which requires probable cause, which requires evidence you can't get without searching the property. It's a perfect circle of protection. How do I break the circle? David closed the file box. You find someone in the current system brave enough to act, or you find a witness with nothing left to lose. Otherwise, Sister Orlean dies of old age. St. Augustine's eventually closes, and those children stay buried forever. Margaret left the university with copies of David's research. Her determination hardened into something like obsession. She understood now why this case had haunted him for decades, because the truth was buried just deep enough to be impossible to reach through legal means. That night, she called Sheriff Bradshaw from her motel room. Sheriff, I need to ask you something off the record. Do you believe Sister Orlean is hiding something? There was a long pause. Miss Chen, please. I'm not trying to trap you. I just need to know if there's any part of you that wonders about those missing children. Tom's voice was heavy when he finally answered. My father was sheriff before me. In 1965, a child named Sarah Duncan disappeared from St. Augustine's. Dad spent weeks searching those mountains. He came home one night, sat at the kitchen table, and told my mother he thought Sister Orlean was lying about something. But he had no proof, and the county pressured him to close the case. Tom cleared his throat. 2 months later, someone donated money to repair the sheriff's department roof. Anonymous donation. My father always wondered if it was hush money. Will you help me? I can't. Not officially, but... Tom seemed to be weighing something. There's a maintenance inspection scheduled at St. Augustine's next week. State requirement. If a social worker happened to be present during that inspection and happened to observe something concerning, well, that would give legal grounds to expand the investigation. It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret thanked him and hung up, already planning her next move. She had 1 week to prepare. 1 week to gather enough evidence to justify a full investigation. 1 week before Sister Orlean realized the walls were closing in and potentially destroyed whatever evidence remained. In the mountains above Harlan County, St. Augustine's home for children sat dark and silent under a moonless sky. In the basement behind the locked door, secrets waited in the cold earth, secrets that had been kept for decades, secrets that were finally beginning to surface. Sister Orlean knelt in her private room, hands clasped in prayer, asking for guidance. But the God she prayed to offered no answers, only the crushing weight of sins that could never be forgiven. Outside, the winter wind howled through the mountains like the cries of children long forgotten. The morning of the maintenance inspection arrived with a cold rain that turned the mountain roads into rivers of mud. Margaret Chen sat in her rental car outside St. Augustine's Home for Children, watching State Inspector Russell Hayes conduct his external assessment of the building. Russell was in his late 40s, a career bureaucrat who'd seen every kind of institutional neglect Kentucky had to offer. Margaret had briefed him on her concerns the day before, careful not to oversell her suspicions but making sure he understood this wasn't a routine visit. Sheriff Bradshaw's patrol car was also present, officially to provide transportation assistance due to the poor road conditions, unofficially to witness whatever they might find. Tom stood on the porch, exchanging strained pleasantries with Sister Orlean, who watched the inspection with barely concealed hostility. "The roof needs complete replacement," Russell called out, making notes on his tablet. "I'm seeing structural damage to the eastern wall, foundation cracks, and—" He paused, kneeling to examine something. "Evidence of water intrusion in the basement windows." "We've requested funds for repairs multiple times," Sister Orlean said sharply. "The state sends barely enough money to keep these children fed, let alone maintain a building that's over 70 years old." "I'll need to inspect the basement," Russell said, standing and brushing mud from his pants. "Water damage can compromise the entire structure." Sister Orlean's face tightened. "The basement is just storage, nothing down there that needs inspecting." "Ma'am, it's not optional. If there's water intrusion, it could lead to mold, structural failure, any number of safety hazards. I need access." The nun stood motionless for a long moment, rain dripping from the edges of her black habit. Margaret could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Refusing would raise immediate suspicion, but allowing access might expose whatever she'd been hiding. "Of course," Sister Orlean finally said, her voice strained. "Sheriff Bradshaw, perhaps you should accompany us, for safety reasons." Inside, the orphanage was unusually quiet. The children had been gathered in the common room for what Sister Orlean called study time, but Margaret noticed how they sat rigid and silent, not studying, but waiting. A teenage girl named Beth kept glancing toward the basement door with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read, fear maybe, or anticipation. Sister Orlean produced a ring of keys from beneath her habit and approached the basement door. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked 3 separate deadbolts, an excessive security measure for what should have been simple storage. "The stairs are steep," she warned. "Watch your step." Russell went first, shining a powerful flashlight down into the darkness. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under his weight. Margaret followed, with Tom and Sister Orlean behind her. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a smell that Margaret couldn't quite identify. Earth, moisture, and something else. Something organic and unsettling. The basement was larger than Margaret expected, extending under most of the building's footprint. Russell's flashlight revealed shelves stacked with old furniture, canning jars and cardboard boxes deteriorating from moisture. Water stains marked the stone foundation walls, and pools of standing water collected in the low spots of the earthen floor. "This is worse than I thought," Russell muttered, examining the foundation. "You've got significant water intrusion, possible foundation instability, and—" He paused, his flashlight fixed on something in the corner. "What's that door?" In the far corner, barely visible behind stacked furniture, was another door. Unlike the simple wooden construction of the basement entrance, this door was heavy oak reinforced with iron straps. Old, possibly as old as the building itself. "That's the old coal cellar," Sister Orlean said quickly. "Sealed up decades ago. Nothing in there." "I need to check it," Russell insisted. "If water's getting into the foundation, it could be flooding the coal cellar. That could destabilize the entire structure. It's been sealed for 40 years. Then there should be no problem opening it." The tension in the basement was palpable. Margaret felt her heart racing, sensing they were on the edge of something significant. Tom's hand moved to rest on his service weapon, more from instinct than threat. Sister Orlean's composure finally cracked. You don't understand. That area is unsafe. The ceiling could collapse. It's why we sealed it in the first place. Ma'am, I'm a licensed structural inspector, Russell said firmly. I'll assess the safety. Now, is there a key or do I need to call for equipment to force it open? They stood in silent standoff for nearly a minute. Finally, Sister Orlean produced another key from her ring, this one older, iron, hand-forged. She moved to the door as if walking to her own execution. The lock resisted at first, rust and age fighting against the key. When it finally turned, the sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Sister Orlean pulled the door open, and a wave of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying that organic smell Margaret had noticed earlier, but stronger now, unmistakable. Death. The smell of death. Russell's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness beyond the door, revealing a tunnel carved into the hillside, not a coal cellar at all, but something else. The walls were rough stone, the floor packed earth, and along the tunnel's length, spaced at irregular intervals, were sections where the earth looked disturbed, sunken slightly, marked with crude wooden crosses. Jesus Christ, Tom whispered, his hand now definitely on his weapon. Margaret felt her knees go weak. She'd expected to find evidence, perhaps documents or testimony, but not this, not an actual burial site. Sister Orlean stood frozen in the doorway, her face ashen in the flashlight's reflected glow. You don't understand, she said, her voice hollow. I gave them peace, I gave them love. They were suffering, all of them suffering, and I... Sister Orlean, Tom said carefully, I need you to step away from that door and come with me upstairs. They were God's mistakes, the nun continued as if she hadn't heard him. Born wrong, damaged, unwanted. Their parents abandoned them because they could see it, the flaw, the wrongness. I tried to fix them. I prayed over them, disciplined them, showed them the path to salvation. But some souls are too broken. Some children are too corrupted by sin to be saved. Russell had his phone out, calling for backup and crime scene investigators. Margaret moved closer to the tunnel entrance, her horror mixed with grim validation. She'd been right. All those missing children, all those unexplained disappearances. How many? She asked quietly. Sister Orlean turned to her, and Margaret saw something in the old woman's eyes she'd seen before in her career. The absolute certainty of the self-righteous, the conviction that comes from believing your actions are divinely ordained. 12, Sister Orlean said. 12 lambs returned to the shepherd, 12 souls freed from their broken vessels. Tom moved forward to handcuff Sister Orlean, but she held up a hand. There's no need for restraints, Sheriff. I won't run. Where would I go? I've spent my entire life in service to these mountains, to these children. If the law demands I answer for my mercy, then so be it. As Tom escorted Sister Orlean upstairs, Margaret and Russell waited for backup. Margaret's mind was reeling, trying to process what they'd found. 12 graves. 12 children who'd been placed in Sister Orlean's care and had died, been murdered. Under circumstances the nun clearly believed were justified. I need to secure the scene, Russell said, his voice shaky. This is... Christ, I've done 1,000 inspections, found neglect, abuse, but I've never found bodies. The children upstairs, Margaret said suddenly. We need to get them out of here. Now. They rushed upstairs to find chaos. News of Sister Orlean's arrest had spread instantly among the children. Some were crying, some were silent with shock, and Beth, the teenage girl Margaret had noticed earlier, stood by the window with an expression of profound relief. Margaret approached her carefully. Beth, are you okay? The girl turned, tears streaming down her face. She's really arrested? She's really gone? Yes. You're safe now. All of you are safe. Beth collapsed into Margaret's arms, sobbing with an intensity that spoke to years of suppressed fear. We knew, she whispered. All of us knew something was wrong. We heard things at night, saw her taking children to the basement, and they'd never come back. But she said if we told anyone, if we said anything, we'd be sent to the basement too, and we'd never come back. Other children began to crowd around, their fear breaking like a dam. Story after story poured out, children taken to the basement for special prayers, punishments that lasted days, a reign of terror disguised as religious devotion. Within an hour, 3 additional sheriff's vehicles arrived along with emergency services to transport the children to temporary housing. Margaret coordinated with her office to ensure all 16 children would be placed in safe facilities while the investigation continued. By late afternoon, the property was swarming with law enforcement. Crime scene investigators had entered the tunnel with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. The rain had stopped, but the property had taken on a grim atmosphere, the kind that seeps into a place where terrible things have happened. Margaret stood outside watching investigators work when Tom approached her. "We've started preliminary excavation," he said quietly. "We've found remains, children's remains. The medical examiner estimates ages between 6 and 12. He paused, his face aged by what he'd witnessed. "You were right. All along, you were right. I wish I hadn't been," Margaret said. Over the next few hours, as darkness fell and portable lights were set up around the property, the full scope of Sister Orlean's crimes began to emerge. The 12 graves contained remains spanning decades. The oldest appeared to be from the early 1960s, the most recent from less than 5 years ago. At the sheriff's station, Sister Orlean sat in an interrogation room, surprisingly calm. Tom and a state police detective named Karen Morrison conducted the interview, with Margaret observing from behind one-way glass. "Tell us about Bobby Hutchins," Karen said, placing a photo of a 6-year-old boy on the table. Sister Orlean looked at the photo with something like fondness. Bobby was one of the first, a wild child, violent, uncontrollable. His mother died of tuberculosis. His father was in prison for shooting a man during a robbery. The devil's mark was on that boy from birth. "So you killed him?" "I freed him," Sister Orlean corrected. "He was suffering, don't you see? Locked in a body that could only express rage and pain. I prayed with him, tried to save his soul, but the corruption ran too deep. One night, God gave me clarity. He showed me that some children are born to suffer, and the greatest mercy is to end that suffering and return their souls to Him for judgment." "How did you kill him?" Karen asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I gave him peace, a pillow over his face while he slept. It was quick, painless. I held him afterward, told him God loved him, that his suffering was over. Then I buried him in the tunnel, in consecrated ground, with prayers for his eternal soul." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. Sister Orlean spoke as if she'd performed a holy act, as if murder was mercy. "And the others?" Tom asked. Sister Orlean went through the list methodically, describing each child's flaws, learning disabilities, behavioral problems, birth defects, mental illness. In her twisted worldview, these children were too damaged to fix, too corrupted to save. She'd convinced herself she was doing God's work, sparing them from lives of suffering while protecting society from their inherent wrongness. "Sarah Duncan heard voices," Sister Orlean explained. "Just like her mother, I could see the madness growing in her eyes. Emma Lou Hoskins was born with a club foot, God's mark of disapproval on her body. James Pritchard couldn't read, couldn't learn, couldn't function in God's world as he intended. Each justification was more horrifying than the last. Sister Orlean had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner for children whose only crime was being vulnerable and different. "Did anyone help you?" Karen asked. "Did anyone know what you were doing?" "I worked alone. The children's suffering was my burden to bear, their salvation my responsibility. Some of the staff suspected perhaps, but they chose not to see. People see what they want to see, especially when the truth is uncomfortable." The interview continued for hours, Sister Orlean confessing to 12 murders with an eerie calmness that spoke to her complete conviction in the righteousness of her actions. She showed no remorse, no understanding that what she'd done was evil. In her mind, she was a saint who'd taken on the terrible burden of mercy killing to spare damaged children from lives not worth living. As dawn broke over Harlan County, news vans began arriving. The story was too big to contain. A beloved nun running an orphanage for decades had secretly been murdering the children in her care. It would become national news within hours. A scandal that would rock not just the county but the entire state's child welfare system. Margaret stood outside the sheriff's station, exhausted and traumatized by what she'd uncovered. A young deputy approached her with coffee and a sympathetic expression. "Ma'am, there's a woman here asking to speak with you. Says her name is Linda. That she's grateful you didn't give up." It was the waitress from the diner, her daughter Annie standing beside her. Annie was in her 30s with kind eyes and her mother's strong features. "I wanted to thank you," Annie said. "I lived at St. Augustine's for 3 years. Every night I was terrified I'd be chosen to go to the basement. Other kids disappeared and we all knew why, but Sister Orlean said if we told anyone we'd be next." Tears rolled down her face. "I've lived with survivor's guilt for 20 years, wondering why I was spared when others weren't. Now at least those children can have proper burials and people will know what happened to them." Margaret hugged the woman, feeling the weight of the case settle onto her shoulders. She'd found the truth, but the truth was almost too horrible to bear. 12 children had died because one woman's mental illness had been enabled by a system that looked the other way, by a community that elevated reputation over protection, by decades of willful blindness. As the sun rose higher, casting light across the mountains, excavation continued at St. Augustine's. Each grave was carefully documented, each small skeleton treated with the dignity and respect these children had been denied in life. Medical examiners would spend weeks identifying remains, and forensic experts would reconstruct exactly how each child died. But Margaret already knew the most important truth. 12 children had been murdered, and their killer had hidden in plain sight for decades, protected by her reputation and the community's unwillingness to question authority. The system had failed Bobby Hutchins, Sarah Duncan, Emma Lou Hoskins, James Pritchard, and 8 others whose names would soon be confirmed. Margaret couldn't bring them back, couldn't undo their suffering. But she could make sure their deaths meant something, that the failures that allowed this horror would be exposed and reformed. As she drove away from Harlan County that morning, Margaret glanced in her rearview mirror at St. Augustine's Home for Children, now surrounded by crime scene tape and swarming with investigators. The building looked different in daylight, smaller, sadder, stripped of whatever benevolent facade it had once maintained. The mountains of Appalachia had kept their secrets for decades, but the dead could finally rest now that the truth had been uncovered. And somewhere in the cold Kentucky ground, 12 children who'd been forgotten by everyone except their killer could finally be mourned, remembered, and laid properly to rest. The Harlan County Courthouse was built in 1912, an imposing stone structure that had witnessed countless trials in its century of service. But it had never seen anything like the case that began on a cold morning in March 1979. The Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Sister Agnes Carver, formerly known as Sister Orlean, charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder. Margaret Chen sat in the gallery, having been subpoenaed as a key witness. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside. National media had descended on the small town, transforming the quiet mountain community into a circus of cameras, reporters, and legal analysts. District Attorney Wallace Crawford stood at the prosecution table, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and a reputation for winning difficult cases. Defending Sister Orlean was Marcus Pemberton, a criminal defense attorney from Louisville who'd taken the case pro bono, claiming every defendant deserved representation regardless of their alleged crimes. Judge Harold Simmons, a Harlan County native who'd sat on the bench for 23 years, called the court to order. His face betrayed no emotion, but Margaret had heard he'd been one of Sister Orlean's financial supporters, had praised her work publicly, had even placed his own nephew at St. Augustine's decades ago. The jury selection had taken 3 weeks, finding 12 impartial citizens in a county where everyone had an opinion about Sister Orlean proved nearly impossible. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging from a young retail worker to a retired coal miner, all looking uncomfortable with the burden they'd been given. Crawford's opening statement was devastating. He walked the jury through each victim, showing photographs of smiling children, reading intake reports that documented their hopes and fears, then describing how each had died at Sister Orlean's hands. Bobby Hutchins was 6 years old when he was placed at St. Augustine's, Crawford began, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. His mother had died of tuberculosis. His father was incarcerated. He had nowhere else to go. Sister Orlean was supposed to protect him, care for him, give him a chance at life. Instead, she smothered him with a pillow because she decided his developmental delays made him unworthy of living. Crawford continued through each victim. Sarah Duncan, age 7, killed because she showed early signs of her mother's mental illness. Emma Lou Hoskins, age 6, murdered because she'd been born with a club foot. James Pritchard, age 8, suffocated because his learning disabilities convinced Sister Orlean he was God's mistake. The defense will tell you Sister Orlean was mentally ill, Crawford said, turning to face the jury directly. They'll claim she truly believed she was doing God's work, that her religious delusions somehow mitigate her guilt. But let me be clear. Sister Orlean knew right from wrong. She hid these bodies. She falsified records. She threatened other children into silence. These were not the actions of a delusional woman. They were the calculated crimes of a murderer who used her position of authority to prey on the most vulnerable children in our society. Pemberton's opening was more subdued. He didn't deny the killings. The evidence was overwhelming, but attempted to paint his client as a deeply disturbed woman whose religious psychosis had convinced her she was saving children from lives of suffering. Sister Orlean suffered a profound psychological break after losing her own daughter in childbirth, Pemberton explained. That trauma, combined with a rigid religious upbringing and isolation in rural Appalachia, created a delusional belief system where she genuinely thought she was doing God's will. She didn't kill these children out of malice or evil intent. She killed them out of a twisted sense of mercy born from untreated mental illness. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Testimony came from forensic experts who'd examined the remains, from former employees who described Sister Orlean's increasingly erratic behavior over the years, from surviving children who recounted the atmosphere of terror that permeated St. Augustine's. Beth, the teenage girl who'd lived at the orphanage, testified for 3 days. Now 16 and living in a foster home in Lexington, she described life under Sister Orlean's rule. She would tell us we were born sinful, Beth said, her voice steady despite visible tears. That some children were so corrupted by their parents' sins that they could never be saved. She'd point to kids with disabilities or learning problems and say they carried the devil's mark. We all knew what happened to those kids eventually. They'd be taken to the basement for special prayer, and we'd never see them again. Did you ever try to tell anyone? Crawford asked gently. Once. I was 9, and a new girl named Katie had just been taken downstairs. I told a volunteer who came to help in the kitchen. Sister Orlean found out. Beth's voice dropped. She locked me in the basement for 3 days with no food, no light. She told me if I ever spoke about the orphanage's private matters again, I'd join Katie and never come back up. Are you afraid of Sister Orlean now? Yes. Even sitting here, knowing she's in custody, I'm terrified. She told us she could see into our souls, that God showed her our sins. For years, I believed her. I thought if I was taken to the basement, it meant I deserved it, that I was one of God's mistakes too. The defense's cross-examination was careful, trying to establish that the children's fear itself proved Sister Orlean's mental instability. No rational person would believe they had divine authority to determine which children lived or died. Medical testimony revealed the causes of death for each victim. Most had been suffocated, though 2 showed signs of strangulation, and 1 appeared to have been given an overdose of medication. Forensic anthropologists testified about the careful way the bodies had been buried, with crude wooden crosses marking each grave. The positioning of the remains suggests ritualistic burial, Dr. Patricia Morrison from the University of Kentucky testified. Each child was wrapped in cloth, laid facing east with hands positioned in prayer. This indicates the perpetrator viewed these killings as having religious significance, not simple disposal of bodies. The most damaging testimony came from Father Patrick Donnelly's deathbed confession. recorded by journalist David Sullivan in 1974. The tape was admitted into evidence over vigorous defense objections. Father Donnelly's weak voice filled the courtroom. "I created a monster. Agnes Carver came to me in 1956, broken by the loss of her child. She said God was punishing her for her sins, that she needed to atone. I thought giving her purpose, giving her a place to serve, would heal her. I gave her a false identity, called her Sister Orlean, and put her in charge of St. Augustine's. But I knew. God help me, I knew she wasn't stable. I knew she saw sin and damnation where others saw innocent children. And I did nothing. I protected her, covered for her, because admitting my mistake would have destroyed my reputation." The tape continued with Father Donnelly describing warning signs he'd ignored. Agnes's obsession with physical perfection, her belief that disabled children were divine punishment, her increasingly rigid interpretation of Scripture. By the time he realized the depth of her delusion, he was dying, too weak to do anything but confess to a journalist. Sister Orlean showed no emotion throughout most of the trial. She sat at the defense table, hands folded, occasionally nodding as if confirming testimony she agreed with. But when the prosecution played recordings of her own confession, the detailed, dispassionate way she described each killing, several jury members turned away, unable to watch her face. The defense called psychiatrists who diagnosed Sister Orlean with delusional disorder, religious type. They testified she genuinely believed she was carrying out divine will, that her psychosis was so complete she couldn't distinguish between her delusions and reality. Dr. Robert Chen, no relation to Margaret, from Johns Hopkins, testified extensively about religious psychosis. Sister Orlean exhibits classic symptoms of messianic delusion, the belief that she has been chosen by God for a special purpose. In her case, that purpose was identifying and freeing children she believed were too damaged to live meaningful lives. This delusion was reinforced by decades of isolation, religious authority, and the community's willingness to overlook warning signs. "Does this mean she didn't know killing children was wrong?" Pemberton asked. "She knew society considered it wrong. But she believed society was wrong, that God's law superseded human law. In her delusional framework, she was performing acts of mercy, not murder." Crawford's cross-examination was brutal. "Dr. Chen, if Sister Orlean truly believed she was doing God's work, why did she hide the bodies? Religious delusion doesn't eliminate self-preservation instincts. Why did she falsify records? She likely rationalized it as necessary to continue her mission. Why did she threaten other children into silence? As I said, the delusion doesn't eliminate awareness of societal norms. So she knew what she was doing was illegal, knew it would be punished, took active steps to conceal her crimes, and threatened witnesses. Doctor, that's not insanity, that's premeditated murder." The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was so silent, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. "On the count of murder in the first degree regarding Bobby Hutchins, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of murder in the first degree regarding Sarah Duncan, how do you find?" "Guilty." 12 times the foreman repeated the word, "guilty." Sister Orlean's expression never changed. She sat motionless as if the verdict was merely confirming something she already knew. Judge Simmons scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Kentucky had the death penalty in 1979, and Crawford had announced he would seek it. But Pemberton filed extensive motions arguing that executing a mentally ill woman violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. During those 2 weeks, Margaret returned to Lexington trying to process everything she'd witnessed. The trial had exposed not just Sister Orlean's crimes, but the systematic failures that enabled them. Inadequate oversight of child welfare facilities, poor record-keeping, a culture that prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. She testified before a state legislative committee investigating the case. Her recommendations were extensive: mandatory inspections of all residential facilities housing children, centralized databases tracking child placements, criminal background checks for all staff, and whistleblower protections for employees reporting abuse. The system failed these 12 children catastrophically, Margaret testified. Sister Orlean was able to murder vulnerable kids for decades because nobody wanted to question a respected community figure. We need safeguards that make it impossible for one person to have that much unchecked power over children's lives. The sentencing hearing was shorter than the trial, but no less emotional. Crawford called family members of the victims, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins who'd lost children they barely knew but mourned nonetheless. Bobby Hutchins' aunt, now in her 60s, testified through tears. Bobby was my brother's son. After my brother went to prison and Bobby's mama died, I wanted to take him, but I was working 2 jobs and couldn't afford another mouth to feed. I thought St. Augustine's would give him a chance. Instead, it gave him a grave. I've lived with that guilt every day for 22 years. Sarah Duncan's older brother, who'd been 12 when she disappeared, described how his mother died believing Sarah had run away because she didn't love them. She never knew Sarah was murdered. She died thinking her baby girl hated her enough to disappear without a word. That's what Sister Orlean took from us, not just Sarah's life, but my mother's peace. When it was Sister Orlean's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her body frail from months in custody. Pemberton advised her to express remorse, to acknowledge the pain she'd caused, but Sister Orlean had her own message. I stand before this court without regret, she said, her voice strong and clear. I did what God commanded. I gave mercy to children who would have suffered their entire lives. Their bodies were flawed, their minds broken, their souls corrupted by the sins of their parents. I freed them from earthly suffering and returned them to the Lord for judgment. The courtroom erupted. Judge Simmons gavelled for order, but Sister Orlean continued. You call me a murderer, but I am a servant of the Lord. History will vindicate me. One day people will understand that true mercy sometimes requires difficult choices, that loving children means sparing them from lives of pain and worthlessness. That's enough, Judge Simmons said sharply. Sit down, Miss Carver. But Sister Orlean remained standing. My only regret is that I couldn't save more of them. There were others, children so damaged, so beyond hope. But I lacked the courage. Those children continue to suffer because I was weak, because I let your laws and your judgments stop me from doing God's work. Guards forcibly returned her to her seat. The gallery buzzed with shock and outrage. Pemberton looked defeated. His client had just destroyed any chance of avoiding the death penalty. Judge Simmons took a moment to compose himself before speaking. Miss Carver, in my 23 years on this bench, I have never encountered evil as pure and unrepentant as what you represent. You were given a sacred trust to care for vulnerable children, and you perverted it into a twisted justification for murder. He sentenced her to 12 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, rejecting the death penalty not out of mercy, but because, as he explained, death would be too quick an end. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison, alone with your delusions, forgotten by the world you believed was too blind to see your supposed righteousness. Sister Orlean was transferred to the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women in Pewee Valley. She would spend the next 27 years there, never admitting wrongdoing, never showing remorse, maintaining until her death in 2006 that she had done God's work. After the sentencing, Margaret stood outside the courthouse with Sheriff Bradshaw. The media circus had finally dissipated, leaving just a few local reporters and townspeople processing what had happened. How's the county handling all this? Margaret asked. Tom's face was drawn, aged by the experience. Not well. Half the people are angry it happened here, angry at the system that let it happen, angry at themselves for not seeing it. The other half are defending Sister Orlean, saying she was set up, that the government wanted to shut down a Christian orphanage. Even after everything that came out in trial? Cognitive dissonance is powerful. Some folks would rather believe in a conspiracy than admit they praised and protected a child killer for decades. Tom shook his head. My father's in a nursing home now, got dementia. But before it got bad, he told me he was glad this came out, that those kids finally got justice. He'd carried the guilt of closing Sarah Duncan's case for 40 years. Margaret learned later that St. Augustine's Home for Children was demolished 6 months after the trial. The property was purchased by the county and turned into a memorial park. 12 trees were planted in a circle, each with a plaque bearing a victim's name. It was small comfort for lives cut short, but it ensured the children would be remembered. The case led to sweeping reforms in Kentucky's child welfare system. Margaret's recommendations were largely adopted, creating stronger oversight and accountability. Other states followed suit, using the Sister Orlean case as a catalyst for improving protections for vulnerable children. But Margaret knew reforms and memorials couldn't undo the fundamental failure. 12 children had been murdered because adults had failed them. Failed to look closely enough, question deeply enough, or act quickly enough. She visited the memorial park once 5 years after the trial. The trees had grown, their branches reaching toward the Appalachian sky. Flowers had been left at the base of each tree by people who never knew these children, but mourned them nonetheless. Standing in that quiet circle, Margaret thought about all the children she'd worked with over her career. Kids saved from neglect, abuse, exploitation. Every success was shadowed by the knowledge that others had fallen through the cracks, had disappeared into systems that failed to protect them. Bobby, Sarah, Emma Lou, James, and 8 others whose names were now carved in stone. They deserved better than what the system had given them. They deserved adults who questioned authority, who investigated suspicions, who chose children's safety over institutional reputation. As Margaret drove away from Harlan County for the last time, she carried those 12 names with her. They would inform every decision she made, every case she worked, every time she had to choose between the easy path and the right one. The mountains of Appalachia stood eternal and unchanging, keeping their remaining secrets while finally releasing the 12 they'd held for so long. And somewhere in that ancient landscape, in the wind that moved through the trees and the rain that fell on the memorial stones, the voices of forgotten children could finally rest. 23 years after Sister Orlean's conviction, Margaret Chen returned to Harlan County. She was now 55, the regional director of Kentucky's Department for Community-Based Services, and she'd been invited to speak at the dedication of a new child advocacy center, built where St. Augustine's once stood. The memorial park had matured, the 12 trees now towering oaks whose roots ran deep into the Kentucky soil. The new facility was modern, warm, designed specifically to help children who'd been abused or neglected. It was named the Sarah Duncan Center for Child Advocacy, after the little girl whose disappearance had haunted Sheriff Tom Bradshaw's father. Tom himself was retired now, living in Lexington near his daughter. He'd driven down for the ceremony, walking with a cane but still carrying the bearing of a lawman. He found Margaret before the dedication began. "Never thought I'd see this day," he said, gesturing toward the new building. "Something good coming from so much pain." "How's the county doing?" Margaret asked. "Still divided?" "Less so. Time has a way of forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. Most folks accept what happened now, though there's still a few who insist Sister Orlean was railroaded." Tom paused, watching workers finish setting up chairs for the ceremony. "My dad died in 2001. Toward the end, when the dementia was bad, he'd forget Sister Orlean was in prison. He'd get agitated, saying he had to find Sarah Duncan, had to keep searching the mountains. Even in his confusion, he remembered that little girl." The ceremony drew a surprising crowd. Locals, state officials, advocacy groups, and former residents of St. Augustine's who'd survived their time there. Beth was among them, now 39, a social worker herself, married with 2 children. She'd turned her trauma into purpose, dedicating her career to protecting vulnerable kids. "I work at a residential facility in Louisville," Beth told Margaret during the reception. "Every day, I make sure the kids feel safe, heard, valued. Everything Sister Orlean didn't do. And I tell my staff, if you see something wrong, you speak up, you don't wait, you don't make excuses, you don't protect the institution, you protect the kids, always." Annie, the waitress Linda's daughter who'd also lived at St. Augustine's, attended with her mother. Linda was in her 70s now, still sharp-eyed and direct. "You saved my daughter's life," Linda told Margaret bluntly. Beth and Annie weren't the kids Sister Orlean targeted, but who knows? Another year, another 2 years? Maybe Annie would have shown some sign Sister Orlean decided was God's mark of disapproval. You stopped her before more kids died. Margaret accepted the gratitude but deflected credit. A lot of people stopped her. Russell Hayes doing his job thoroughly, Tom following through on suspicions despite political pressure, David Sullivan documenting evidence even though his story never ran. It took all of us. David Sullivan had also come to the ceremony, now teaching journalism at the University of Kentucky, and using the Sister Orlean case as a cautionary tale about investigative persistence. His students produced a documentary about the case in 2000, interviewing survivors, reviewing evidence, and examining how one woman's crimes had gone undetected for decades. During the dedication ceremony, various speakers addressed the legacy of what had happened at St. Augustine's. The governor spoke about Kentucky's improved child welfare system. A child psychologist discussed trauma and healing. A representative from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children talked about systemic failures in child protection. But the most powerful speech came from Michael Chen's younger sister, Emma. Michael had been one of Sister Orlean's victims, killed in 1976 when he was 9 years old. Emma had been 6 when her brother was placed at St. Augustine's and never came home. "I'm 42 now," Emma said, standing at the podium with quiet dignity. "Older than my brother will ever be. For years, my family believed Michael had been adopted, that he was living somewhere with a new family, maybe thinking about us sometimes. We grieved losing him but took comfort in imagining he was happy, safe, loved." Emma's voice broke slightly, finding out he'd been murdered, that he'd died scared and alone, believing he deserved it because a twisted woman convinced him he was God's mistake. That destroyed our family's healing. My mother never recovered. She died in 1995, consumed by guilt that she'd placed Michael somewhere she thought was safe. "But this center," Emma continued, gesturing toward the building, "represents the only meaningful response to that kind of tragedy. We can't bring back the 12 children who died. We can't undo the trauma of the children who survived. But we can make sure it never happens again. We can build systems that protect kids, that listen to them, that value their lives above institutional reputation or community comfort." The dedication ended with the planting of a 13th tree, not for a victim, but as a symbol of hope and vigilance. Its plaque read, "In memory of all children failed by those sworn to protect them, and in commitment to never again choose silence over safety." After the ceremony, Margaret walked through the memorial with Beth, who'd brought her own children, a 10-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter. "Do they know about St. Augustine's?" Margaret asked. "They know their mom lived in an orphanage where bad things happened, and that brave people stopped the bad things. When they're older, I'll tell them the full truth. But for now, I want them to understand that speaking up matters, that protecting vulnerable people matters, that you don't look away from evil just because it's uncomfortable." They stopped at Sarah Duncan's tree, where fresh flowers had been left, likely by Tom or his family. Beth's daughter, curious and precocious, asked who Sarah was. "She was a little girl who needed help," Beth explained gently. "And the adults who should have protected her didn't do their job. So now we remember her, and we promise to do better." The little girl seemed satisfied with that answer. She placed her hand on the tree's trunk, feeling the rough bark, connecting with a history she couldn't fully comprehend, but was learning to honor. As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the memorial, Margaret reflected on how far Kentucky's child welfare system had come. Annual inspections were mandatory now. Background checks were thorough. Children had advocates and ombudsmen. Whistleblower protections existed. Records were digitized and cross-referenced. But Margaret knew no system was perfect. Somewhere in Kentucky, in America, in the world, vulnerable children were still being failed by adults who should protect them. Abuse still happened behind closed doors. Warning signs were still ignored. Institutions still prioritized reputation over accountability. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. Tom found Margaret as she was preparing to leave. "I got something to show you," he said, leading her to his car. He pulled out an old file box, his father's personal records from the Sarah Duncan investigation. "Dad kept his own notes, separate from official files," Tom explained. After he died, I went through his things and found these. He documented every suspicion, every inconsistency, every reason he thought Sister Orlean was lying. He just couldn't prove any of it. Inside were handwritten observations spanning years, notes about children who disappeared without proper paperwork, interviews with former employees who'd witnessed disturbing behavior, even rough maps of the St. Augustine's property with circled areas where the ground looked disturbed. "Your father knew," Margaret said, reading through the meticulous documentation. "He suspected for years but couldn't get the evidence he needed." "He failed Sarah Duncan," Tom said quietly, "but he made damn sure he documented everything so if someone ever did find proof, they'd have a roadmap. In his way, he helped bring Sister Orlean to justice, even if he didn't live to see it." Margaret understood then that solving the Sister Orlean case hadn't been a singular achievement but the culmination of decades of people trying, failing, documenting, persisting. Father Donnelly's deathbed confession, Tom's father's meticulous notes, David Sullivan's unpublished investigation, the anonymous former employee who'd called Margaret that night, Russell Hayes's thorough inspection. All of them contributed pieces that eventually formed a complete picture. As Margaret drove back to Lexington that evening, she thought about legacy, what we leave behind, how our actions echo through time. Sister Orlean's legacy was 12 murdered children and trauma that rippled through generations. But the legacy of those who stopped her, that was the Sarah Duncan Center improved child welfare systems, survivors like Beth who dedicated themselves to protecting others. 23 years after the trial, Sister Orlean was still alive in prison, now in her 80s and suffering from dementia. Reports indicated she no longer remembered her crimes, living instead in a confused present where she still believed herself a devoted nun serving vulnerable children. Margaret felt no satisfaction in that. There was no justice in an old woman forgetting the evil she'd committed. True justice was the children sleeping safely in improved foster care systems. Justice was whistleblowers protected by law when they reported abuse. Justice was the memorial trees growing strong and tall, ensuring 12 forgotten children would always be remembered. Margaret retired from child welfare work in 2005, but she never stopped advocating. She taught seminars on recognizing institutional abuse, testified before legislatures about child protection reforms, and mentored young social workers entering the field. In 2006, she received a call informing her that Sister Orlean had died in prison of natural causes at age 83. Margaret felt nothing, no closure, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that a dark chapter had finally closed. Sister Orlean was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery. No family claimed her body. No one attended her funeral except the prison chaplain who performed a brief, perfunctory service. The woman who'd spent decades believing she did God's work died alone, unmourned. Her name synonymous with evil rather than mercy. The Appalachian Mountains witnessed it all. The crimes, the investigation, the trial, the memorial, and finally the perpetrator's lonely death. They stood eternal and indifferent, having seen human evil and human goodness play out across their ancient slopes for generations. And in Harlan County, the 12 oak trees continued to grow, their branches reaching toward the sky, their roots intertwined beneath the earth, a living monument to children who deserved better, whose deaths demanded change, whose memories inspired vigilance against evil hiding behind benevolent facades. On quiet evenings when the wind moved through those 12 trees, locals sometimes said they could hear whispers, not ghosts, not supernatural, but the very human reminder that some stories can never be forgotten, that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing, and that protecting vulnerable children requires eternal vigilance against those who would harm them. The story of Sister Orlean and her 12 victims became part of Appalachian lore, told not to frighten but to educate, not to sensationalize but to honor. Every social worker trained in Kentucky learned about the case. Every child advocate studied what went wrong and how to prevent similar tragedies. And every year on October 14th, the date Bobby Hutchins disappeared in 1963, the first of Sister Orlean's victims, people gathered at the memorial to remember not just the 12 children who died, but all vulnerable children who depend on adults to protect them. speak for them, and never choose silence over safety. Margaret attended that annual memorial until her death in 2018 at age 72. She was buried in Lexington, but a plaque was added to the memorial at the Sarah Duncan Center, acknowledging her role in bringing the truth to light. Beth continued her work protecting children, eventually becoming the director of Kentucky's largest child advocacy center. She trained her staff with stories from St. Augustine's, not to traumatize them, but to instill the absolute necessity of vigilance, of questioning, of never assuming authority. Figures are beyond scrutiny. The case files on Sister Orlean remain open for research, used by criminologists studying serial killers, by psychologists examining religious psychosis, by child welfare experts analyzing systemic failures. The 12 victims are no longer forgotten. Their names, their stories, their stolen lives documented and studied so their deaths might prevent future tragedies. In the end, that was the only justice possible. Turning tragedy into teaching, transforming pain into purpose, ensuring that 12 children who died in darkness and silence were now remembered in light and spoken of openly, honestly, as a warning that evil sometimes wears the mask of righteousness, and that protecting children requires courage to challenge even the most respected members of society. The mountains of Appalachia keep many secrets still, but the secret of what happened at St. Augustine's home for children is no longer among them. It stands revealed, examined, memorialized, a dark chapter in history that can never be forgotten and must never be repeated. And somewhere in the wind that moves through those 12 oak trees, the voices of Bobby, Sarah, Emmylou, James, Michael, Daisy, Katie, Rebecca, Thomas, Melissa, Christopher, and Daniel finally rest, knowing they are remembered, honored, and that their deaths changed a system that failed them, protecting countless children who will never know how close they came to a similar fate. The story ends not with closure. There is no closure for murdered children, but with commitment to vigilance, commitment to protecting the vulnerable, commitment to speaking truth even when silence is easier, commitment to ensuring that no child ever again disappears into darkness while adults look away. That commitment is their legacy. That commitment is their memorial. That commitment is the only justice the dead can receive from the living.